Part 3. Sensei and His Testament. Chapter 1. I received 2 or 3 letters from you this summer. I remember clearly that in the second one, you wrote asking for my help in securing a suitable position in Tokyo. When I read it, I felt I should do something. At the very least, I thought I must reply. But to be honest, I made no effort at all in response to your request. As you know, my social circle is extremely limited. So much so that it's more accurate to say I live alone in the world. I had absolutely no means or opportunity to help in that way. But that is not the issue. The truth is, I was preoccupied with how to deal with myself. Should I continue to exist like a mummy, left behind among the living? Or, each time I repeated the words, or else. In my mind, I shuddered. As if I had run up to the edge of a cliff and looked down into a bottomless chasm. I was a coward, and like many other cowards, I was tormented by anguish. Regrettably, at that time, you barely existed in my consciousness. It is no exaggeration to say that. Going a step further, your position, your livelihood, they meant nothing to me. I didn't care at all. I was in no condition to worry about such things. I left your letter in the envelope, arms folded, deep in thought. Why? I wondered, would someone with a decent inheritance be so desperate, scrambling for a position before even graduating? I merely cast such a glance in your direction, from afar, with a bitter feeling. I am confessing this not to anger you with blunt words, but to offer an excuse for my silence. I believe my true intent will be clear to you after you finish reading this letter. In any case, since I remained silent when I should have at least offered some response, I want to apologize before you for my negligence. Later, I sent you a telegram. Frankly, at that time, I wanted to see you. I also wanted to tell you about my past, as you had asked. You replied by telegram that you could not come to Tokyo, and I understood your situation better when I received your long letter afterward. I never thought of you as rude or inconsiderate. How could you leave home when your dear father was gravely ill? The fault was mine for forgetting your father's condition when I sent the telegram. And yet, while you were in Tokyo, I had warned you to be careful because his illness was serious. I am a man full of contradictions. Perhaps it is not my brain, but the weight of my past that has warped me into such a person. I acknowledge this fault as mine and ask for your forgiveness. When I read your last letter, the final one you sent, I realized I had done wrong. I thought I should reply and picked up my pen, but I couldn't write even a single line and stopped. If I were to write, I wanted it to be this letter. Yet it was too soon for this letter then. That's why I sent another simple telegram telling you not to come. Chapter 2. I began writing this letter after that. Since I rarely write, I found it painful that my thoughts and events would not flow as I wished. I nearly abandoned my obligation to you. But no matter how often I stopped, it was no use. Within an hour, I would feel the urge to write again. To you, it may seem like a reflection of my sense of duty. I won't deny that. As you know, I am a solitary man, almost completely isolated from society. So there is little in my life that can be called a duty. Whether by intent or by nature, I have pared down my life as much as possible. But that doesn't mean I am indifferent to duty. On the contrary, I am too sensitive, and without the strength to endure emotional strain, I have ended up living this withdrawn life. That's why, once I promise something, not fulfilling it leaves me feeling deeply troubled. I pick up the pen again to avoid that unpleasant feeling toward you. Besides that, I want to write. Setting aside the matter of duty, I want to write about my past. My past is my own experience, my own possession. You might say it's a shame to die without sharing it. I feel a little of that myself, but I would rather take it to the grave than give it to someone who cannot truly receive it. If you did not exist, then my past would simply remain mine alone, never even indirectly reaching another soul. Of the tens of millions in Japan, I want to tell only you. Because you are earnest. Because you once told me you wanted to gain real lessons from life. I will cast the shadow of my dark life over your head without hesitation. But don't be afraid. Gaze into the darkness. From within it, grasp something you can use. When I say dark, I mean ethically dark. I was born with a strong sense of ethics and raised in that way. My ethical views may differ greatly from those of today's youth. But right or wrong, they are truly mine, not something borrowed. That's why I think they may be of some use to you as you begin to grow. You may remember how you often engaged me in debate on modern philosophical issues. You also understand how I responded. I did not despise your views, but neither could I respect them. Your ideas lacked depth, and you were still too young to have a past of your own. I sometimes laughed at you. You sometimes looked at me with frustration. Eventually, you begged me to unfold the picture scroll of my past before you. At that moment, for the first time, I respected you. Because I saw you were determined to pull something alive from within me. Because you showed the will to split open my heart and drink the warm blood that flowed from it. I was still alive then. I feared death. That's why I put it off for another day and rejected your request. But now, I myself will break open my own heart and splash its blood on your face. If, when my pulse has stopped, a new life is born in your chest, I will be content. Chapter 3. I lost both my parents before I turned 20. My wife may have mentioned this to you, but they died of the same illness, and almost at the same time, just as she said. My father contracted a terrible case of typhoid fever. My mother, who nursed him, caught it as well. I was their only child. We had a decent family fortune, and I was raised rather indulgently. Looking back, I think that if either one, just one, of my parents had survived, I might have been able to retain that gentle, easygoing outlook on life. I was left behind in a daze. I had no knowledge, no experience, and no judgment. When my father died, my mother could not be by his side. When my mother died, we hadn't even told her that father had passed. Whether she guessed it, or, as others said, believed he was recovering, I do not know. She entrusted everything to my uncle. Pointing toward me, she said, "Please take care of this child." I had already received permission from my parents to go to Tokyo, so I think she intended to mention that as well. When she added to Tokyo, my uncle quickly answered, "Very well. Don't worry." Perhaps she was the type who could endure high fever. My uncle praised her as a strong woman and complimented her to me. But whether her words were truly her final wishes, I'm not sure. She certainly knew the name of the terrifying illness my father had, and she knew she had contracted it too. But whether she believed she would die from it, that is still open to doubt. Often, even when her words during a high fever were logical and coherent, they would leave no trace in her memory later. But that is not the point. Still, this tendency to unravel and analyze things like this, or to turn them around and look at them from all sides, this habit had already taken root in me at that time. I thought it best to mention that to you from the start. Descriptions like these, which may seem unrelated to the matter at hand, might serve as examples. Please read with that understanding. This temperament of mine eventually led me to doubt the moral character of others more and more. It certainly played a major role in the suffering and anguish I later experienced. Please keep that in mind. Since digressing makes things harder to understand, let me return to the main thread. Even so, I think that in writing this long letter, I may be a bit more composed than others in a similar situation. The sound of the streetcars, which begins when the world falls asleep, has already ceased. Outside the shuttered windows, the faint chirp of a lonely insect gently recalls the autumn dew. My ignorant wife sleeps soundly in the next room. As I write, each stroke of the pen forms letters, one by one. I am facing the paper with a rather calm mind. Though my hand may slip from inexperience, my thoughts are not in chaos, nor is my writing disordered. Chapter 4. Anyway, left all alone, I had no choice but to rely on my uncle as my mother had instructed. My uncle took full responsibility and managed everything for me. He also arranged for me to go to Tokyo, as I had hoped. I came to Tokyo and entered a higher school. Students at higher schools back then were much more savage and rough than they are now. One of the boys I knew got into a fight with a laborer in the middle of the night and injured the man's head with a wooden clog. It happened after he had been drinking, and while they were brawling, the laborer managed to snatch his school cap. Inside the cap was a name tag on a white diamond-shaped cloth, clearly identifying its owner. That made things complicated, and it came very close to the police contacting the school. However, his friends worked hard behind the scenes, and the matter was finally settled without becoming public. If I told you, raised in the refined atmosphere of today, about such violent behavior, you'd surely think it absurd. I think it's absurd too. But those students had a kind of rustic simplicity that today's students lack. The monthly allowance I received from my uncle was far less than the school funds you now receive from your father. Of course, the cost of living was also different. Even so, I never felt the least bit deprived. In fact, among my many classmates, I was not in a pitiable situation that made me envy others. Looking back now, I was probably envied instead. I say this because, aside from the fixed monthly allowance, I frequently requested extra money for books. Since I loved buying books even then, and for other occasional expenses, and I was able to spend freely as I wished. I knew nothing at the time and not only trusted my uncle, but always felt grateful and respected him as someone worthy of esteem. My uncle was a businessman. He even became a member of the prefectural assembly. Perhaps due to that connection, I recall he also had some ties to political parties. Though he was my father's younger brother, he developed in a completely different direction in terms of personality. My father was a man of steady character who carefully preserved the family estate inherited from his ancestors. For enjoyment, he practiced tea ceremony and flower arranging. He also liked reading poetry collections and had a keen interest in calligraphy, paintings, and antiques. Though our home was in the countryside, antique dealers from the town, about 5 miles away where my uncle lived, would sometimes bring scrolls and incense burners to show to my father. In short, you could describe my father as a man of means. A rural gentleman with relatively refined tastes. In terms of disposition, there was a great contrast between him and my free-spirited uncle. Even so, the two of them strangely got along very well. My father would often praise my uncle, saying he was a much more capable and dependable man than himself. He also said that people like him, who inherited wealth from their parents, inevitably lost their edge. They lacked the need to struggle with the world, and that was no good. My mother heard him say this. So did I? I think he said it as advice for me. You do well to remember this, he said, looking me directly in the face. That's why I still remember it. How could I ever have doubted my uncle, who was trusted and praised by my father to that extent? To me, he was a man to be proud of. And after my parents died, and I had to rely on him for everything, he became more than just a source of pride. He became essential to my very existence. Chapter 5. When I returned to my hometown for the first time during summer vacation, the house that had once belonged to my now-deceased parents was occupied by my uncle and his wife, who had moved in as its new residence. This had been agreed upon before I left for Tokyo. Since I was the only one left behind and would not be living there was no other option. At the time, my uncle seemed to be involved with several companies in the town. From a business standpoint, he laughed and said it was far more convenient for him to live in his original residence in town rather than move 2 away to my family's house. He had made this remark during discussions after my parents' deaths about what to do with the estate and how I would go off to Tokyo. Our house had a long history and was known to some degree in the area. I imagine it's the same in your hometown. But in the countryside, tearing down or selling a historic home with a living heir is considered a major event. I wouldn't think much of it now, but I was still a child then. I had left for Tokyo but felt that the house had to be preserved as it was, and this caused me great distress. My uncle reluctantly agreed to move into the vacant house, but he insisted that his residence in town remain as it was, so that he could conveniently travel back and forth between the two. Naturally, I had no objections. My only concern was getting to Tokyo under any condition. As a child, even though I had left my hometown, I still longed for our home with a traveler's heart, thinking there was always a place for me to return to. Even though I was eager to be in Tokyo, I still strongly felt that I must return home when vacation came. I studied diligently, played joyfully, and often dreamed of returning to that beloved house during my breaks. I don't know how my uncle managed traveling between the two homes while I was away, but when I arrived, the entire family was together in the country house. Normally, the children who attended school likely lived in the town, but for the summer holiday, they were brought back to the countryside, half for leisure. Everyone was happy to see me. I was also pleased to find the house even livelier and more cheerful than when my parents had been alive. My uncle made the oldest boy, who had taken over my old room, vacate it so I could use it, though there were plenty of other rooms, and I said I didn't mind using one of those. My uncle insisted, saying, "It's your home." Apart from occasionally recalling my late parents, I spent that summer without any unpleasant incidents, living with my uncle's family and eventually returning to Tokyo. The only thing from that summer that cast a somewhat gloomy shadow on my mind was how my uncle and aunt repeatedly urged me, who had just entered higher school, to get married. They brought it up 3 or 4 times. At first, I was simply surprised by the suddenness of it. The second time, I clearly refused. By the third, I had to ask for their reasoning. Their intent was simple. They wanted me to marry early, return to this house, and inherit my late father's position. I thought of the house as something I could return to during vacations. Inheriting my father's position and needing a wife for that made sense in theory. I understood well, given the rural customs I grew up with. I wasn't entirely opposed to the idea either. But having just started my studies in Tokyo, the idea of marriage felt like a far-off thing seen through a telescope. I didn't agree to my uncle's request and left my house once more. Chapter 6. I completely forgot about the marriage proposal. Looking around at the young faces surrounding me, not one of them showed any trace of a domestic life. Everyone seemed free and independent. Of course, perhaps some of them were already married, forced into it by family circumstances, but my childish mind never noticed. And perhaps those who were in such situations were careful not to mention such private matters, staying silent out of courtesy. In hindsight, I myself was already in that group, but I didn't even realize it. Like a child, I cheerfully continued my studies. At the end of the school year, I packed my trunk again and returned to the countryside where my parents' graves were. Just like the previous year, I saw the unchanged faces of my uncle, his wife, and their children in the house where my parents once lived. I again smelled the familiar scent of my hometown, which remained dear to me. As a break from the monotony of school life, it was truly welcome. But in the very same environment that had raised me, I was once again suddenly confronted with the topic of marriage by my uncle. What he said was a repetition of last year's persuasion, with the same reasoning. However, unlike the previous time, when there had been no specific person in mind, this time the crucial individual had already been chosen. That made things even more difficult for me. The person in question was my uncle's daughter. My cousin. My uncle said it would be convenient for both families if I married her, and that my father had spoken of such things while he was alive. I, too, thought it would indeed be convenient. It also seemed plausible that my father would have discussed such a matter with my uncle. But I only realized this after my uncle mentioned it. It had never occurred to me before. That's why I was surprised. Yet I also understood the reasonableness of his wish. Maybe I was careless. Or maybe the main reason was simply that I had no special feelings for that cousin. Since childhood, I had often visited and stayed at my uncle's house in town. I had been close to that cousin since those days. You know yourself that romantic feelings rarely develop between siblings. Perhaps I'm extending this accepted truth too far, but I believe that when a man and woman become too familiar from constant contact, the fresh feeling needed to spark love fades. Just as fragrance is strongest the moment incense is lit, and flavor peaks at the first sip of wine, the impulse of love seems to reside in one sharp instant on the timeline. Once you've passed through that point calmly, the more familiar you become, the more affection may grow, but the nerves of love dull steadily. No matter how I reconsidered it, I couldn't bring myself to take my cousin as my wife. My uncle said that if I insisted, we could postpone the marriage until after I graduated. But he also said, quoting the saying, "Strike while the iron is hot," that he'd like to at least have the engagement ceremony done while I was home. Since I had no intention of marrying her, it didn't matter to me either way. I declined again. My uncle frowned. My cousin cried. Not because she was heartbroken that I wouldn't marry her, but because, as a woman, it hurt to be rejected. Just as I didn't love her, I knew well that she didn't love me. I returned to Tokyo once more. Chapter 7. When I returned home for the third time, it was at the beginning of summer, a year later. I always fled Tokyo as soon as the school year ended. I missed my hometown that much. You must know the feeling too. Your birthplace has a different color in the air, a distinct scent to the earth, and memories of your parents drift more vividly there. For me, spending the 2 months of July and August in that place, wrapped up like a snake coiled in its hole, brought the warmest and most comforting feeling of the entire year. Naively, I didn't think I had much to worry about regarding the matter of marrying my cousin. If something was unpleasant, I would just refuse it. And once I refused, I believed nothing would remain of it. So even though I didn't bend my will to my uncle's hopes, I felt perfectly at ease. Over the past year, I had never once dwelled on it, and I returned home with my usual cheerful spirit. But when I got home, my uncle's demeanor had changed. He no longer welcomed me warmly or held me close like before. Still, with my easygoing nature, I didn't notice anything strange for the first 4 or 5 days. Then, at some point, I suddenly sensed something was off. Oddly enough, it wasn't just my uncle, it was also my aunt. My cousin, too, was acting strangely. Even my uncle's son, who had just graduated from middle school and was planning to go to the higher commercial school in Tokyo, seemed different, though we had exchanged letters about it. Given my nature, I couldn't help but think about it. Why had my feelings changed? Or rather, why had their attitude changed? I began to suspect that my late father and mother had washed the dullness from my eyes so that I could suddenly see the world clearly. Somewhere deep inside, I had believed that even after their deaths, they still loved me just as they had in life. Of course, even at that time, I wasn't entirely lacking in reason, but the superstitions passed down through my ancestors still lay hidden deep in my blood. I'm sure they still do. I went alone to the mountains and knelt before my parents' graves. Half in mourning, half in gratitude, I knelt there. I prayed that my future happiness, which still seemed to be held in their hands lying beneath the cold stone, would be protected by them. You might laugh at this. I wouldn't blame you if you did, but that's the kind of person I was. My world changed as swiftly as flipping the palm of my hand, though this wasn't the first time it had happened. When I was 16 or 17, I was startled when I first discovered that there were beautiful things in the world. I rubbed my eyes, doubting them again and again, and shouted in my heart, "How beautiful!" At 16 or 17, Boys and girls alike are said to become aware of attraction. It was at that age that I, too, was able to perceive women for the first time as representatives of beauty in the world. Until then, I had never even noticed the opposite sex. Suddenly, my blind eyes opened to them. From that moment, my entire world became something new. So too was it with my uncle's change in attitude. I noticed it suddenly. It came without warning or preparation. All at once, he and his family appeared completely different to me. I was shocked, and I felt that if I left things as they were, I wouldn't know where I was heading. Chapter 8. I began to feel that unless I gained a clear understanding of the family property I had left entirely in my uncle's care, I would be failing my late parents. My uncle, claiming he was always busy, never stayed in one place. He would spend 2 days at home and 3 in town, moving back and forth between the two, always looking unsettled. He constantly said he was busy. When I had no suspicions, I believed he truly was busy, or perhaps I interpreted it cynically, as the fashionable thing to say nowadays. But when I became intent on having a detailed conversation about the estate and saw how he always acted, busy, I began to feel it was nothing more than an excuse to avoid me. I could hardly find a chance to pin him down. I heard rumors that my uncle kept a mistress in town. A former classmate from middle school told me, for someone like my uncle, having a mistress wasn't surprising at all. But I had never heard such gossip while my father was alive, so I was shocked. My friend shared other rumors about my uncle as well. For instance, that he had once been on the verge of bankruptcy in business, but had recently made a rapid comeback. This rumor, too, strongly deepened my doubts. Eventually, I confronted my uncle. Calling it a confrontation might sound harsh, but the flow of our conversation naturally led to that tone. My uncle tried to treat me like a child to the end, but I approached him with eyes full of suspicion from the start. There was no way such a conversation would end peacefully. Unfortunately, I don't have time to describe the full details of that confrontation here. To be honest, I have something far more important to tell you. I've been restraining myself from writing about it. My pen has long been eager to get there. Having lost the chance to speak with you quietly in person forever, not only am I unused to writing, but I must also save precious time by omitting even things I'd like to include. You may still remember how I once told you that there are no inherently evil people in this world, that most good people suddenly turn bad when the right moment comes, and that one must never let their guard down. You told me then that I seemed agitated, and asked under what circumstances good people turn bad. When I simply replied, "Money," you looked dissatisfied. I remember that look on your face clearly. Now I confess, at that time, I was thinking about my uncle. I was thinking of him with hatred, as an example of how even someone seemingly trustworthy can turn evil at the sight of money. Perhaps my answer felt too simple for someone like you, who strives to delve deeper into the world of ideas. Perhaps it sounded trite, but to me, it was a living truth. After all, wasn't I agitated? I believe that expressing ordinary truths passionately is more alive than mouthing new ideas with a cold head. Because it's the power of blood that moves the body. Because words don't just ripple through the air. They can strike more powerfully at something deeper. Chapter 9. To put it bluntly, my uncle embezzled my inheritance. He did it easily over the 3 years I was away in Tokyo. Trusting him completely and staying carefree, I was, from a worldly perspective, a real fool. From a perspective beyond the worldly, you might call me a pure and noble soul. Looking back on myself at that time, I bitterly regret not being more cunning. I can't help but feel resentful of my own honesty. Yet at the same time, there's a part of me that longs to return to that innocent state and live as I was once born. Remember this, the version of me you know is one already stained with dust. If calling someone a senior means they've lived longer in dirtiness, then I am certainly your senior. Had I agreed to marry my cousin, as my uncle wished, would the result have been materially favorable for me? That hardly needs thinking about. My uncle schemed to force his daughter on me, not out of goodwill or mutual family convenience, but driven by base self-interest. I didn't love my cousin, though I didn't dislike her either. Looking back, I feel somewhat glad I refused. Either way, I would have been deceived. But by not marrying her, at least I didn't play into his hands completely. That gives me a slight sense of personal victory. Though it's a trivial matter, not worth serious discussion. If you were to judge it, you'd probably think it a foolish point of pride. Other relatives intervened between me and my uncle, but I didn't trust them at all. If anything, I saw them as enemies. Once I realized my uncle had deceived me, I became convinced everyone else would do the same. If even the uncle my father had praised so highly turned out like this, how could I trust anyone else? That was my logic. Still, they gathered all my property and organized it for me. The total, when calculated in monetary value, was far less than I had expected. I had only two choices: accept it quietly or take my uncle to court. I was angry. I was confused. I feared a long legal battle. As a student, I couldn't afford to waste precious time. In the end, I asked an old middle school friend living in town to convert all my assets into cash. He advised me against it, but I didn't listen. I resolved then to leave my hometown for good. I vowed never to see my uncle's face again. Before leaving, I visited my parents' graves once more. I have not seen those graves since. I probably never will. My friend did as I asked, though only some time after I had returned to Tokyo. Land in the countryside doesn't sell easily, and there's always the risk of being taken advantage of. The money I ultimately received was much less than market value. To confess, the only inheritance I carried with me was a small amount of public bonds, and the money my friend later sent. Even before, my parents' estate must have diminished significantly. But since I wasn't the one who actively reduced it, I felt all the worse. Still, it was more than enough to live on as a student. In fact, I couldn't even use half of the interest it generated. This comfortable student life led me, unexpectedly, into a situation I had never imagined. Chapter 10. Being free from financial hardship, I began to think about moving out of my noisy boarding house and setting up a house of my own. But doing so would mean the trouble of buying household furnishings, needing a housekeeper, making sure she was honest, and being worried if the house wasn't secure while I was out. So it didn't seem like something I could do so easily. One day, moved by a vague impulse to at least look for a house, I took a walk westward from Hongo Plateau, going straight down the Koishikawa slope toward Denzuen. The area is completely changed now due to the streetcar line, but at that time, to the left was the long mud wall of the artillery arsenal, and to the right was an open field overgrown with grass, neither exactly a plain nor a hill. I stood there in the grass, absent-mindedly gazing at the cliff across the way. Even today, it's not a bad view, but back then, the western side had a much more serene character. The deep greenery stretching out in every direction calmed my nerves. I suddenly wondered if there might be a suitable house around there. I crossed the grassland and headed north along a narrow path. That area, which still feels rundown even today, was quite shabby back then. I wandered through alleys and turned corners, walking in circles. Eventually, I asked the lady at a candy shop if she knew of a modest rental house in the area. She tilted her head and said, "Well," but didn't seem to recall anything. I gave up hope and was about to leave when she asked, "Would a private boarding house do?" I changed my mind. Boarding at a quiet private home would be more convenient than managing a household. I sat on a stool in the candy shop and asked her for more details. It was a house lived in by a military family, more accurately, the family of a deceased soldier. The lady said the husband had died during the Sino-Japanese War or something like that. Until about a year ago, they had lived near the military academy in Ichigaya, but the house had a stable and was too large, so they sold it and moved here. Since then, the widow had asked the shopkeeper to help find a suitable lodger to fill the loneliness of the empty house. I confirmed with the lady that only the widow, her daughter, and a maid lived in the house. It sounded peaceful and ideal. Still, I hesitated. I wondered whether someone like me, just a student with an unknown background, might be turned away outright. I thought about giving up. But I wasn't poorly dressed for a student. I also wore my university cap. You might laugh at that and ask what difference it makes. But back then, university students were held in much higher regard than they are now. I even felt a kind of pride in that square cap. So, just as the lady had suggested, I visited the military family without an introduction. I met the widow and explained my purpose. She asked many questions about my background, school, and field of study. Perhaps she found some assurance in my answers, because she immediately said I could move in whenever I liked. The widow was a proper and clear-minded person. I was impressed and thought all military wives must be like that. I was both impressed and surprised. With such a character, I wondered how she could feel lonely at all. Chapter 11. I promptly moved into the house and rented the same sitting room where I had first spoken with the widow. It was the best room in the house. At that time, upscale boarding houses were starting to appear in the Hongo area, so I had a fair idea of what kind of room a student could expect. My new room was much finer than those. At first, it even seemed too good for a student like me. The room was 8 mats in size, had a tokonoma alcove with a tiered shelf next to it, and an ashiar closet on the wall opposite the veranda. There were no windows, but sunlight came brightly through the south-facing veranda. On the day I moved in, I noticed a flower arrangement in the tokonoma and a kodo leaning against the wall beside it. I didn't like either. Having been raised near a father who appreciated poetry, calligraphy, and senchati, I had developed a taste for more Chinese-influenced aesthetics from childhood. Perhaps because of that, I had come to disdain such decorative, feminine touches. My father's collection of artistic items had been ruined by that infamous uncle of mine, but a few things remained. When I left home, I entrusted most of them to an old friend from middle school, and I brought 4 or 5 scrolls with me in the bottom of my trunk. I planned to hang them in my room for enjoyment, but upon seeing the kodo and flowers, I lost the nerve. Later, I learned that the flowers had been arranged as a kind of welcome for me, and I smiled wryly to myself. The kodo, I was told, had always been there and was probably left in the tokonoma simply for lack of storage space. You probably can't help but imagine a young woman behind all this. Even before I moved in, my curiosity had already been stirred. Whether it was that impure motive affecting my natural behavior or simply because I hadn't yet grown comfortable with others, when I first met the daughter, I stammered through an awkward greeting. She blushed as well. Until then, I had imagined the daughter based on the widow's appearance and demeanor. But that image wasn't very favorable. I had reasoned. She's a military wife, so she must be like this. Her daughter, therefore, must be like that. But the moment I saw the girl's face, all those assumptions were shattered. And then, a sense of femininity I had never imagined entered my mind for the first time. From that point on, I no longer disliked the flowers arranged in my tokonoma, nor did the kodo seem like an unwelcome presence. The flowers were regularly changed as they wilted, and the kodo was frequently moved to a zigzagging hallway room. I would rest my chin on my hand at my desk and listen to it being played. I couldn't tell if the playing was good or bad, but since it didn't seem to involve complicated fingerwork, I guessed it wasn't very skilled, about the same level as the flower arrangements. I could judge flowers well, and I knew the daughter wasn't particularly good at arranging them. Still, various flowers continued to decorate my room without hesitation. The arrangements never changed, and the vase was always the same. But the music was even more peculiar. She would pluck the strings slowly and never raised her voice. It wasn't that she didn't sing. She just sang so softly, it was like a secret being whispered. And if she got scolded, her voice disappeared completely. Even so, I was glad to gaze at her clumsy flower arrangements and listen to her awkward playing. Chapter 12. My mood had already become pessimistic by the time I left home. The belief that other people couldn't be trusted had seeped into my very bones. I had come to see my uncle, my aunt, and all the rest of my relatives as representatives of humanity. Even on the train, I would observe the passengers next to me suspiciously. If someone spoke to me, I'd grow even more guarded. My mind was gloomy. At times, I felt a heaviness like I had swallowed lead. And yet, my nerves had become sharp and hypersensitive, as I've described. This mental state was likely the main reason I wanted to move out of my original boarding house when I arrived in Tokyo. It could be said that only because I had the money did I even consider renting a house, but under normal circumstances, even with extra cash, I wouldn't have willingly taken on the trouble. After moving to Koishikawa, I couldn't relax or ease this tension for a while. I felt almost ashamed of how nervously I watched everyone around me. My mind worked, and my eyes observed sharply, but my mouth, in contrast, grew quieter and quieter. Like a cat, I silently observed the behavior of the people in the house while sitting at my desk. I watched them so closely that I sometimes felt sorry for them. I even thought, I must look like a pickpocket, and grew disgusted with myself. You must find this strange, how someone like me could grow fond of the daughter in that house. How I could find joy in her clumsy flower arrangements and her awkward koto playing. If you ask, I can only say, both were simply facts. I leave the interpretation to you, but I will add just one thing. I doubted humanity when it came to money, but not when it came to love. So even if, to others or even to myself, these feelings seemed strange or contradictory, they coexisted easily in my heart. I always referred to the widow as the lady of the house, so I'll use that term from here on. She described me as quiet and well-mannered. She also praised me for being studious, but she never mentioned my anxious eyes or my nervous demeanor. Whether she didn't notice or chose not to say, I don't know, but she seemed to pay it no mind. In fact, once she called me generous and spoke to me with a kind of reverence. I blushed and denied it, but she said earnestly, "You say that because you don't realize it yourself." Apparently, she hadn't originally planned to rent the room to a student like me. She had asked the neighbors to find someone, perhaps a civil servant, who needed lodging. Because she imagined someone who was forced to stay at a private boarding house due to a limited salary, she compared that person to me and saw me as generous. Compared to such a person, I might indeed have seemed easy with money. But that wasn't a matter of personality. It had little to do with my inner life. Still, as a woman, she tried to extend that one trait to describe my whole character. Chapter 13. My wife's demeanor naturally began to affect my mood. Before long, my eyes no longer darted about as they used to. I began to feel as though my heart had settled firmly in the place I sat. In short, it was likely because my wife and the rest of the household took no notice whatsoever of my cynical glances or suspicious attitude that I was granted a great sense of peace. My nerves gradually calmed, perhaps because there was no reflective reaction coming back from them. My wife was a woman of understanding, so perhaps she deliberately treated me that way. Or, as she sometimes stated openly, perhaps she simply observed me as being composed and magnanimous. It may also be that the eccentricities in my mind did not manifest outwardly to any noticeable degree, and so she was deceived without realizing it. As my mind settled, I gradually grew closer with the family. I began to exchange jokes with both my wife and the young lady. Sometimes they would call me to the next room for tea. Other times, I would bring back sweets and invite the two of them over to my side in the evening. I felt as though the circle of my social interactions had suddenly expanded. This often cut into the time I should have spent studying, but strangely, this interference never bothered me in the least. My wife, of course, was a woman of leisure. The young lady, though she went to school and studied things like flower arrangement and the kodo, somehow seemed to have ample free time. The three of us, whenever we saw each other, would sit together and chat idly about the world. It was usually the young lady who came to call on me. Sometimes she would turn at a right angle from the veranda and stand before my room. Other times, she would pass through the sitting room and appear from behind the sliding doors of the adjoining room. She would pause for a moment there, then invariably call my name and ask, "Studying?" I was usually seated before a difficult book, staring at it intently. From the outside, I must have looked like quite the studious man. But in truth, I wasn't all that devoted to my reading. Though my eyes were fixed on the pages, I was mostly waiting for the young lady to come and call on me. When she didn't, I would eventually get up myself and go to the room in front of hers, calling out, "Studying?" The young lady's room was a six-mat room adjoining the sitting room. My wife was sometimes in the sitting room and sometimes in the young lady's room. Essentially, these two rooms had a partition, but it was as though it wasn't there. The mother and daughter passed freely between them and occupied both spaces without distinction. When I called out from outside, it was always my wife who replied, "Come in." The young lady, even if she was there, almost never answered. Occasionally, when the young lady came to my room on some errand, she would sit down and chat for a while. At such times, I would feel strangely uneasy. It wasn't simply that I was nervous about sitting face to face with a young woman. I began to feel restless. My own unnatural behavior, as though I were betraying myself, troubled me deeply. But the young lady, in contrast, appeared completely unbothered. It was almost hard to believe this was the same girl who could barely raise her voice when practicing the kodo. Sometimes, even when her mother called her from the sitting room, she would just answer yes and not get up for quite a while. And yet, she was certainly no child. I could see that clearly. There were even signs that she acted in such a way deliberately to make that clear to me. Chapter 14. After the young lady left the room, I would let out a sigh of relief. At the same time, I felt a vague sense of emptiness and regret. Perhaps I had a womanly nature. To you, as a young man of today, I must seem all the more so. But in those days, most of us were like that. My wife almost never went out. Even when she did leave the house, she never left just the two of us, her daughter and me, alone together. I don't know whether that was by coincidence or by design. It may sound strange for me to say so, but observing my wife closely, I sometimes got the sense that she wanted to bring her daughter and me closer together. Yet at other times, she seemed subtly wary of me. Encountering such a situation for the first time, I was occasionally disturbed. I wished my wife would adopt one consistent attitude. From a logical standpoint, her behavior was clearly contradictory. But the memory of having been deceived by my uncle still fresh in my mind, I couldn't help but entertain a further step of doubt. I suspected that one of my wife's attitudes was real and the other false, and I found myself unable to judge which. More than that, I couldn't grasp the meaning behind such strange conduct. Even when I tried to reason it out, I couldn't. In the end, I resigned myself by blaming everything on women. That's just how women are, I thought. Women are foolish creatures. Whenever my thoughts reached an impasse, they always ended up there. And yet, I, who had looked down on women so, found myself unable to look down on the young lady. My logic was entirely powerless before her. Toward her, I felt something like faith. You might find it odd that I use a word I normally reserve for religion to describe a young woman, but even now I believe it firmly. true love is not so different from religious faith. Whenever I saw her face, I felt as though I became a better person. Just thinking of her filled me with a noble spirit. If love is a mysterious thing with two ends, one elevated and sacred, the other base and carnal, then surely my love had grasped the former. Of course, I am a human being, a creature of flesh, but the eyes with which I saw her and the heart with which I thought of her were utterly free from any trace of carnality. As my feelings of resistance toward the mother grew, so too did my feelings of love toward the daughter. As such, the relationship between the three of us gradually grew more complicated than when I had first come to lodge there. Most of these changes, however, were internal and showed little outward sign. Then, by a chance occurrence, I came to wonder whether I had been mistaken about my wife all along. I began to think that her seemingly contradictory attitudes toward me might both be genuine. What's more, I came to believe that those opposing feelings coexisted within her at all times, without one overtaking the other. In other words, even as she tried to draw her daughter and me closer together, she simultaneously kept a wary eye on me. That may seem like a contradiction, but I concluded that when she was being cautious, it wasn't because she had abandoned or reversed her other stance. She still wanted us close, just not beyond the degree she considered appropriate. Since I had never approached her daughter from a carnal perspective, I thought her concern unnecessary, but I no longer bore her any ill will. Chapter 15. Combining and reflecting on various aspects of my wife's behavior, I became certain that I was fully trusted in that household. I even discovered evidence that this trust had existed since our very first meeting. For someone like me, who had only recently begun to suspect others, this realization came with a certain strangeness. I thought, perhaps women possess a more intuitive nature than men. At the same time, I wondered if this is also why women are so easily deceived by men. And yet, even as I observed my wife in that way, I myself was guided by a similarly strong intuition toward the young lady. In retrospect, this seems rather ironic. While I swore never to trust anyone again, I had absolute faith in her. And yet, I found it strange that my wife trusted me. I spoke little about my hometown. I said nothing at all about the recent events. Even recalling them brought a certain unpleasantness to mind. I tried to focus instead on listening to what my wife had to say, but she wouldn't have it. She continually sought to know more about my background. In the end, I told her everything. I told her I would never return home, that there was nothing for me there but the graves of my parents. My wife seemed deeply moved. The young lady cried. I felt I had done the right thing by sharing. I was happy. Having heard everything, my wife began to treat me almost as though I were a young relative of hers. It was clear she believed her intuition had been correct. I didn't mind her change in manner. In fact, I found it rather pleasant. But before long, my old suspicions began to stir once more. The doubt started from a mere trifle, but as those trifles accumulated, the suspicion began to take root. I came to wonder, perhaps my wife, like my uncle, was deliberately trying to bring her daughter close to me for a specific purpose. Once that thought occurred, the woman who had once seemed so kind suddenly took on the guise of a cunning schemer. I bit my lip in bitterness. From the start, my wife had said she kept lodgers because the house was lonely and lacked company. I had no reason to doubt that. Even after we became close and shared many personal stories, I still saw no falsehood in her explanation. But financially, the household wasn't especially well off. From a practical standpoint, it wouldn't have been a loss for them to establish a special relationship with me. So, I began to guard myself once more. But what good is that when I loved the daughter as deeply as I did? No amount of caution toward the mother could erase that. I laughed at myself, alone. I called myself a fool and cursed myself. Still, if that contradiction were the only issue, I could have borne it with little pain. But my real torment began when I began to wonder, could the young lady be a schemer as well? Could the two of them be working together behind my back, orchestrating everything? The thought made me unbearably distressed. It wasn't just discomfort. It was as if I were at a total impasse, completely trapped. And yet, I still believed in the young lady absolutely. I stood paralyzed, caught between conviction and doubt. Both seemed like mere fantasies, and yet both also felt like truths. Chapter 16. I continued to attend school as usual, but the lectures given by the professors felt distant, as though I were hearing them from far away. My studies were the same. The printed words entered my eyes, but before they could soak into the depths of my heart, they vanished like smoke. On top of that, I became less talkative. A few of my friends misunderstood this and told others that I was immersed in deep thought or something of the sort. I did not try to correct this misunderstanding. I was actually pleased that they had given me a convenient mask. Still, perhaps I was not entirely satisfied, because now and then I would suddenly burst out in a fit of excitement and startle them. The house I boarded in had few visitors. It seemed they did not have many relatives either. Occasionally, the young lady's school friends would come to visit, but they would speak in such low voices that it was hard to tell whether they were even there. It never occurred to me that they were doing so out of consideration for me. After all, the people who visited me weren't rowdy types, and not one of them felt any need to be cautious around the family. In that sense, I, the lodger, was more like the master of the house, while the young lady herself seemed more like a mere guest. But that's just an aside. It doesn't really matter. What did matter was something else. From the sitting room, or perhaps the young lady's room, I would occasionally hear a man's voice. It was quite different from my guests. It was very low. Because of that, I couldn't make out what was being said, and the less I could understand, the more my nerves would become agitated. I would sit there and grow irritated. I would wonder, is he a relative or just an acquaintance? Is he a young man or someone older? Of course, I couldn't find out just by sitting there. But I couldn't just get up and open the sliding doors either. My nerves didn't so much tremble as pulse with heavy waves of distress. After the visitor left, I would always ask the wife or the young lady who it was. Their replies were always vague. Though I showed them my dissatisfaction, I didn't have the courage to press them for a proper answer. I probably didn't have the right to, either. Torn between my pride, instilled in me through my upbringing, and the hungry, longing expression I wore despite myself, I would reveal both at once before them. They would laugh. I couldn't tell whether it was out of mockery, goodwill, or an attempt to appear good-natured. I became too flustered to interpret their meaning, and afterwards, I would repeatedly wonder to myself if I had been made a fool of. I was a free man. I could have left school halfway through, lived wherever I wanted, married whomever I pleased, and I didn't need to consult anyone about it. There were many times when I resolved to ask the wife if I could marry the young lady. But each time, I hesitated and never voiced it. It wasn't because I was afraid of being rejected. Even if I had been rejected, it would have meant a change in my destiny, perhaps even a chance to view a new world from a different perspective. That much courage I could have mustered. But what I hated most was being lured in. I despised being played. Having been deceived by my uncle, I resolved never to let anyone deceive me again. Chapter 17. Seeing that I bought nothing but books, the wife suggested I should get some clothes made. I really only owned cotton garments woven in the countryside. Students back then didn't wear anything with silk in it. I had a friend whose family were merchants in Yokohama and lived quite lavishly. Once, a silk undergarment was delivered to him. Everyone laughed when they saw it. Embarrassed, he tried to explain it away, but in the end, he threw it into the bottom of his trunk and never used it. Then a group of us forcibly made him wear it. Unfortunately, the garment got lice. Taking this as a good excuse, my friend rolled it up and, during a walk, threw it into a large ditch in Nizu. I watched from the bridge, laughing at the whole scene, and not once did I feel the slightest regret. Compared to those days, I had grown up quite a bit, but I still hadn't reached the point where I would make clothes for myself. I thought, in my strange way, that one needn't worry about clothing until graduating and growing a beard. So I told the wife that I needed books, but not clothes. She knew how many books I was buying and asked if I read them all. Some of them, including dictionaries, I hadn't even cut the pages of. I had no answer. I realized then that whether you waste money on books or clothes, it's the same. Moreover, under the pretext of returning the favors I'd received, I wanted to buy a sash or some cloth that the young lady would like. So I entrusted everything to the wife. She insisted I come along. The young lady, too, had to come. Unlike today, we students were not in the habit of walking around with young women. I was still very much a slave to convention, so I hesitated, but in the end, decided to go. The young lady was quite dressed up. She already had a pale complexion, but with the extra powder, she stood out even more. People on the street stared at her, and then turned to look at me, which felt strange. The three of us went to Nyanbashi and bought what we needed. We changed our minds a lot during the shopping, so it took longer than expected. The wife would consult me by name. Sometimes she would drape the fabric across the young lady's shoulder and chest, then step back a few paces and ask me to take a look. Each time, I would give my opinion. That won't do, or that looks nice, like a proper gentleman. We spent so long shopping that by the time we were done, it was dinner. As a thank you, the wife treated me to a meal in a narrow alley near the Kaharadana Vaudeville Theater. The alley was narrow, and the restaurant was narrow too. I was surprised by the wife's familiarity with the area, since I had no knowledge of it myself. We returned home late at night. The next day was Sunday, so I stayed in all day. When I went to school Monday morning, one of my classmates teased me right away. He asked when I had taken a wife, in an obviously exaggerated tone. He then said my wife was extremely beautiful. Apparently, he had seen the three of us out in Nyanbashi. Chapter 18. I went home and told the wife and young lady what had happened. The wife laughed, but then looked at me and said it must have been a nuisance. At that moment, I thought, so this is how men try to attract a woman's attention. The wife's gaze carried enough meaning to make me feel that way. Perhaps it would have been best to confess my feelings to her then and there. But I was already burdened by a heavy fog of doubt. I tried to speak, but held back, and instead shifted the direction of the conversation. I removed myself from the issue and instead tried to probe the wife's thoughts about her daughter's marriage. She told me plainly that there had been a few discussions already. But since the young lady was still in school and quite young, they weren't in any rush. Although she didn't say it outright, the wife seemed to place great value on her daughter's appearance. She even said something along the lines of, if we wanted to, we could settle it any time. Also, the fact that the young lady was their only child seemed to be a reason they were reluctant to part with her. I suspected they couldn't even decide whether to marry her off or bring in a son-in-law. As we talked, I felt like I had learned many things from the wife. But at the same time, I realized I had missed my opportunity. I couldn't bring myself to say a single word about my own feelings. I wrapped up the conversation vaguely and got up to return to my room. The young lady, who had been nearby laughing just moments before, had moved to the far corner with her back turned. When I stood up and glanced back, I saw her sitting in front of the cupboard. Through the 1-foot-wide gap in the sliding door, I noticed she was looking at something on her lap. I saw a piece of fabric we had bought the day before. It was the same cupboard where both our garments had been stored. Just as I was about to leave without a word, the wife suddenly asked me what I thought. Her question was so sudden and vague that I couldn't tell what she meant until she clarified. Should they marry off the young lady quickly or not? I answered that it would be better to take things slowly. The wife said she thought so too. Into this relationship between the wife, the young lady, and me, Another man entered. His becoming part of the household brought a great change to my fate. Had he not crossed the path of my life, I probably wouldn't be writing you this long account. It's as if I unknowingly stood in the path of a devil and, without realizing it, let its shadow darken my entire life. To be honest, I was the one who brought him into the house. Naturally, I needed the wife's permission, so I explained everything and asked her. But she told me not to. Despite my reasons for needing to bring him, she had no clear reason to say no. So I forced my hand, convinced I was doing the right thing. Chapter 19. I shall refer to that friend of mine as K. K and I had been close since childhood. By saying since childhood, you can probably infer that we were from the same hometown. K was the son of a Shin Buddhist priest. He was not the eldest son, but the second, and thus was adopted by a physician. In our hometown, the Honganji sect had strong influence, and compared to others, Shin priests were relatively well off materially. For example, if a priest had a daughter who had come of age, the parishioners would consult with one another to arrange a suitable marriage for her. Naturally, the expenses didn't come out of the priest's own pocket. Because of this, most Shin temples were fairly prosperous. K's family had a reasonable standard of living. Whether they truly had the means to send their second son to study in Tokyo, I don't know. Perhaps because such an opportunity arose, the adoption into the physician's family was arranged. I can't say for sure. At any rate, K was adopted into a physician's household. This happened when we were still in middle school. I still remember how surprised I was when the teacher called roll and suddenly announced K's surname had changed. K's adoptive family was also quite wealthy. It was from them that he received his allowance to study in Tokyo. Although we didn't come to Tokyo together, once he arrived, he immediately moved into the same lodging house as I. At that time, it was common for 2 or 3 students to share a room and live together. K and I shared one room. Like animals captured in the mountains and thrown into a cage, clinging to each other while glaring out at the outside world, we too feared Tokyo and its people. Yet within our 6-mat room, we spoke as if we looked down on the world from on high. Still, we were earnest. We truly meant to become great men, especially K. He was steadfast. Being born in a temple, he frequently used the word asceticism. All his actions and behavior could be described by that one word, or so it seemed to me. I always held a quiet reverence for K in my heart. Even from his middle school days, K often troubled me with complex questions about religion and philosophy. Whether this was the influence of his father or a result of being raised in a temple, I couldn't say. In any case, K seemed to possess a character more priestly than most priests themselves. Originally, his adoptive family intended for him to become a doctor, which is why they sent him to Tokyo. But he, stubborn as he was, came determined not to follow that path. I confronted him, saying that this was no different from deceiving his adoptive parents. Boldly, he replied that it was so. He said that if it was for the sake of the way, such a thing was permissible. Most likely, even he didn't fully understand what he meant by the way. Certainly, I didn't. But for us, in our youth, this vague term resonated with a certain nobility. Even if we didn't understand it, being moved by that lofty sentiment and striving toward it showed no sign of baseness. I agreed with K's position. How much strength my agreement gave him, I don't know. K, single-minded as he was, likely would have followed his own course regardless of my opposition. Still, I understood, even as a youth, that by offering my support, I bore some responsibility. Even if I lacked that awareness at the time, if ever I had to look back upon those days as an adult, I was determined to shoulder the share of responsibility that belonged to me. That is the spirit in which I agreed with him. Chapter 20. K and I entered the same department. With a calm expression, K began walking the path he wanted, using the money sent from his adoptive family. I think there were 2 feelings in K's heart: the reassurance that they wouldn't find out, and the boldness that even if they did, it didn't matter. He was much more nonchalant about it than I was. Kei did not return home during the first summer break. He said he was going to rent a room in a temple in Kamagome and study. When I returned in early September, sure enough, I found him cloistered in a dirty temple near the Great Cannon. His room was a small one next to the main hall, and he seemed pleased that he could study there as he pleased. I recall that it was then I began to notice how much his lifestyle was becoming more like that of a priest. He wore a string of prayer beads around his wrist. When I asked what they were for, he mimed counting them with his thumb. Apparently, he would count the beads on the loop many times a day. As for its meaning, I didn't understand. If you keep counting round beads on a loop, there's no end to it. I often wonder what sort of thoughts led him to stop and pause while turning those beads. It may be trivial, but I find myself thinking about it. I also saw a Bible in his room. I had often heard him mention Buddhist sutras, but I had never once heard him talk about Christianity, nor did I remember any instance of him being asked about it. So I was a little surprised. I couldn't help but ask him why. He said there was no particular reason. If something was so widely respected, then it made sense to read it. He even said that, given the chance, he'd read the Quran too. He seemed quite intrigued by the words Muhammad and the sword. During the second summer, he finally returned home after being summoned. It seems he never mentioned his field of study, and his family didn't ask about it either. You, having gone through school, probably understand how things work, but the general public is shockingly ignorant about student life and school regulations. What is ordinary to us never reaches the outside world. We, being constantly immersed in our academic environment, tend to overestimate how much the public knows about it. Kei probably understood society better than I did in that regard. He returned with a calm demeanor. Since I had traveled with him when he left, I asked him as soon as we boarded the train, "So, how did it go?" Kei simply replied, "It was nothing." The third summer was the year I decided to leave my parents' grave and hometown for good. I urged Kei to return home that year, but he refused. "What's the point of going back every year?" he said. He seemed intent on staying behind to study again. Left with no other option, I departed Tokyo alone. As I wrote before, those 2 months I spent in my hometown were filled with turbulence that shaped my fate, so I won't repeat it here. I returned to Tokyo in September, carrying frustration, melancholy, and loneliness in my heart. And there, I met Kei again. It turned out that his life had also undergone a change. While I was away, he had written to his adoptive family and confessed everything. He said he had always intended to do so. Perhaps he hoped that by doing this, they would resign themselves and tell him to follow the path he wanted. In any case, he did not intend to keep deceiving them all the way through university. Or perhaps he had realized that such deception could not last forever. Chapter 21. Kei's adoptive father was furious upon reading the letter. He immediately sent back a harsh response saying that he could not continue supporting someone so disgraceful as to deceive their parents. Kei showed me the letter. Around the same time, he also received one from his birth family, which he also showed me. This letter, too, was filled with stern reproach. Perhaps because they felt they had wronged the adoptive family, they wrote that they would no longer support him either. Whether Kei would return to the family register of his birth family or find some way to compromise and remain with his adoptive family was a matter for the future. The more pressing issue was how to cover his monthly living expenses. I asked Kei if he had any plans. He said he intended to work as a night school teacher. In those days, society was more relaxed than it is now, and side jobs weren't as hard to come by as you might think. I thought he would be able to manage, but I also had a responsibility. When Kei chose to go against the wishes of his adoptive family and pursue his own path, I was the one who supported his decision. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. I immediately offered financial assistance, but Kei firmly refused it. Given his personality, it made sense. He found it far more agreeable to stand on his own than to live under the protection of a friend. Now that he had entered university, he said, he would be no man if he couldn't support himself. I couldn't bear to wound his pride just to fulfill my own sense of duty, so I let him do as he wished and stepped back. Kei soon found a job that suited him, but knowing how much he valued his time, I could imagine how burdensome the work must have been. He didn't relax his studies in the slightest and bore the added load with determination. I worried about his health, but with his strong-willed nature, he simply laughed and brushed off my concerns. Meanwhile, things with his adoptive family became increasingly complicated. As his schedule grew tighter, we had fewer opportunities to talk, and I never learned all the details. But I knew the situation was becoming more difficult. I knew someone had tried to mediate and encouraged Kei to return home through a letter. But Kei, true to his stubborn nature, said it was impossible and refused. He claimed it was because of school, but from the other side, it surely looked like obstinacy. That made things even worse. In angering his adoptive family, he also earned the wrath of his birth family. When I, concerned, tried to smooth things over by writing letters to both sides, I received no reply at all. My letters were simply ignored. That angered me. Until then, I had sided with Kei mostly out of circumstance, but from then on, I became fully committed to supporting him, regardless of right or wrong. In the end, Kei formally returned to his birth family's register. His birth family agreed to repay the adoptive family for the tuition money. In exchange, they wrote that from now on, he could do whatever he liked. They no longer cared. In old-fashioned terms, it was essentially a disownment. Perhaps it wasn't quite so harsh, but Kei interpreted it that way. He had no mother. I believe one aspect of his character was the result of being raised by a stepmother. If his real mother had been alive, perhaps his ties to his birth family wouldn't have become so strained. His father, as you'd expect, was a priest, but in his strict sense of duty, he seemed to resemble a samurai more than a monk. Chapter 22. After Kei's situation had somewhat settled, I received a long letter from his sister's husband. Since Kei had been adopted into a family related to this man, Kei once told me that this man's opinion had carried weight both when he arranged the adoption and when Kei later returned to his original family register. The letter asked for news of how Kei was doing. It also requested a reply as soon as possible, since his sister was worried. Kei was more fond of this sister, who had married into another family, than of his older brother who had taken over the temple. Although they were siblings born to the same parents, there was a considerable age difference between Kei and his sister. So when Kei was a child, it seems that she appeared more like a real mother to him than their stepmother did. I showed the letter to Kei. He didn't say anything, but he confessed that he had received 2 or 3 similar letters directly from his sister. He said that each time he replied, telling her not to worry. Unfortunately, since she had married into a family without much financial means, she couldn't do anything for her brother materially, no matter how deeply she sympathized with him. I sent a reply to Kei's brother-in-law, saying much the same as Kei had. I also added, in strong words, that if anything ever happened, I would take care of Kei no matter what, and that they should rest assured. That was entirely my own decision. Of course, my letter was partly intended to give comfort to his sister who was worried about Kei's future. But there was also a kind of defiance toward both his original and adoptive families, who, as I saw it, had treated him with contempt. Kei had returned to his original family register in his first year of college. From then until the middle of his second year, about a year and a half, he supported himself entirely on his own. But over time, this constant exertion seemed to begin affecting his health and his mental state. No doubt the constant worry and annoyance over leaving his adoptive family contributed to this. He became increasingly sentimental. At times, he would say things as though he alone were carrying the burden of the world's misfortune. And when I tried to talk him out of that idea, he would flare up immediately. He grew irritated, as if the light that once lay before his future was gradually fading from his sight. When people begin their studies, they usually set out with grand ambitions, full of hope. But after a year or two, and with graduation in sight, they often realize how slow their progress has been and become disillusioned. Kay was no exception, but his frustration was much more intense than most. I finally decided that the only thing to do was to help calm his mood. I told him to stop doing unnecessary work. I advised him to take it easy for a while and even play a little, that doing so would be better for his long-term future. Knowing how stubborn Kay was, I had expected that he would not easily accept my advice. And in fact, convincing him turned out to be more difficult than I had anticipated. Kay insisted that study was not his goal. He said that his purpose was to cultivate willpower and become a strong person. He concluded that in order to achieve this, he had to remain in a state of hardship. To most people, this would sound like sheer madness. What's more, even though he was living in hardship, his will didn't seem to be getting any stronger at all. In fact, he was practically suffering from nervous exhaustion. I had no choice but to pretend to sympathize with him. I even said outright that I intended to live life in a similar way, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely untrue. Listening to Kay's arguments, I found myself being drawn toward his thinking. He had that kind of power. In the end, I proposed that we live together and pursue the path of self-improvement side by side. In order to bend his stubborn will, I went so far as to humble myself before him. And finally, I managed to bring him to live at my house. Chapter 23. My room had an adjoining format space, like an antechamber. To reach my main room from the entrance, one had to pass through this small room, which made it very inconvenient in practical terms. I put Kay in that room. At first, I had intended for us to share the main 8-mat room with 2 desks placed side by side and use the next room jointly. But Kay preferred being alone, even in cramped quarters, and chose the smaller room himself. As I mentioned before, the lady of the house initially disapproved of this arrangement. She said that while in a lodging house, having 2 or 3 people might be more economical than one. This wasn't a business, so it would be better to avoid such things. When I said Kay wasn't the kind of person who would cause trouble, she replied that even if he wasn't troublesome, she disliked people whose personalities were unknown. When I pointed out that she hadn't known mine at first either, she insisted that she had understood me from the beginning. I could only smile wryly. Then she changed her argument. She said I shouldn't bring Kay because it would be bad for me. When I asked why it would be bad for me, she smiled wryly in turn. To tell the truth, I wasn't absolutely required to live with Kay, but I thought that if I presented him with money each month to cover his expenses, he would hesitate to accept it. He was that fiercely independent. So instead, I decided to have him live at my house and secretly give money to the lady of the house to cover food for 2, without Kay ever knowing. However, I had no intention of discussing Kay's financial situation with her. I spoke only of his health. I told her that living alone would only make him more eccentric. I added various details, such as how he had fallen out with his adoptive family and been separated from his birth family. I told her I was taking Kay in with the resolve to share my warmth with someone drowning. I asked both her and her daughter to look after him kindly. With all this, I finally persuaded her. But since Kay hadn't heard any of this from me, he remained completely unaware of how it had all come about. I was actually glad for that, and welcomed him without saying a word. The lady and her daughter kindly helped him unpack and settle in. I took their kindness as an expression of goodwill toward me, and I was pleased in my heart, despite Kay's unchanged stiff demeanor. When I asked Kay how he felt about his new home, he merely said, "Not bad." But to me, it was more than not bad. The place he'd lived before had been a damp, smelly, dirty, north-facing room. The food there was just as miserable as the room. Compared to that, moving into my home was like ascending from a valley to a tall tree. But Kei showed no sign of appreciation. That was partly because of his stubbornness, but also due to his beliefs. Raised on Buddhist teachings, Kei considered any talk of comfort in clothing, food, or shelter as practically immoral. Influenced by stories of old saints and monks, he had a habit of separating the body from the spirit. Perhaps he even believed that mortifying the flesh would enhance the radiance of the soul. I tried not to oppose him. I aimed to melt the ice by putting it out in the sun. I believed that once he melted and became warm water, he would eventually come to realize things on his own. Chapter 24. Thanks to the way I was treated by the lady of the house, I gradually became more cheerful. Aware of that transformation in myself, I decided to try applying the same approach to Kei. Although I knew well, having spent much time with him, that our personalities were quite different, I hoped that just as my rough edges had softened in this household, Kei's heart might also eventually find peace if he stayed here. Kei was a man of stronger will than I. He probably studied twice as much as I did. On top of that, he was naturally more intelligent. Later, we specialized in different fields, so I can't compare, but when we were in the same class in middle and high school, Kei was always ranked higher. I was always aware that I could never match him, no matter what I did. Yet when I forcibly brought him to my house, I believed that I had a better grasp of reason than he did. To me, Kei seemed not to understand the difference between endurance and patience. I want to emphasize this point especially for your sake, so please listen. Our physical and mental abilities can grow or break under external stimulation. And in either case, that stimulation must increase gradually. Otherwise, there's a risk of heading into increasingly dangerous territory without anyone realizing it. Doctors say that nothing is lazier than the human stomach. If you eat only porridge, you eventually lose the ability to digest anything firmer. So, doctors advise practicing eating various foods. But I think this isn't just about building habits. Rather, as stimuli increase, so too must our body's resistance. Now imagine what happens if the stomach's strength gradually weakens instead. You can easily understand the result. Kei was a greater man than I, but he failed to notice this point. He seemed to believe that if he simply got used to hardship, it would eventually stop being hard. He was convinced that if he endured suffering over and over again, the repetition itself would bring him to a point where he no longer minded it. When I tried to persuade Kei, I really wanted to make this clear to him, but I knew he would just argue. I also knew he would surely bring up examples from the past. And if he did, I'd be forced to point out how Kei was different from those people. If Kei were the kind of man who could accept that, it would be fine. But his personality didn't allow for that. If the argument went that far, he would never back down. He would push forward, and then act on what he had said. Once he reached that point, he was terrifying. He was magnificent. He destroyed himself as he pressed forward. In the end, he was great only in the sense that he shattered his own success. But even so, he was never ordinary. Knowing his nature, I found myself unable to say anything more. As I mentioned before, I also felt he was somewhat afflicted with nervous exhaustion. Even if I managed to persuade him, I was certain he would become agitated. I wasn't afraid of quarreling with him, but when I thought of my own time of loneliness and how I had struggled with it, I couldn't bear to place my dear friend in the same situation. The thought of pushing him into an even deeper solitude was all the more unbearable. So even after Kei moved in with me, I refrained from giving him any kind of advice for the time being. I simply observed the effects that his new environment would have on him. Chapter 25. I went around behind the scenes and asked the widow and her daughter to talk with Kei as much as possible. I believed that his long silence in life had finally caught up with him, like in used iron rusts. I could only think that rust had begun to appear in his heart. The widow laughed. and said he was a difficult person to engage. The daughter even gave me examples to explain. When asked if there were any coals in the brazier, Kei would reply no. If she offered to bring some, he would say he didn't need any. If asked whether he was cold, he would say he was, but that he didn't want any warmth, and then say nothing more. I couldn't just sit there with a wry smile. Out of sympathy, I had to say something to patch things up. Since it was spring, there was no real need to sit by the fire, but I still thought it was no wonder people found him difficult to approach. So I tried, as much as possible, to be the central link connecting the two women with Kei. Sometimes I would call the women into the room when I was talking with Kei, or I would pull Kei into a room where I was already talking with them. Either way, I would use whatever method suited the situation to bring them closer together. Of course, Kei didn't like it. Sometimes he would suddenly stand and leave the room. At other times, no matter how much I called, he wouldn't come. "What's so interesting about idle chatter like that?" he would say. I only smiled, but inside, I knew well that he looked down on me for it. In a sense, I may have truly deserved his contempt. It might be said that his standards were far loftier than mine. I wouldn't deny that. But if only the eye is lofty and the rest doesn't match, it's a kind of deformity. Above all, I thought it was my duty to make him more human. No matter how much his head was filled with the images of great men, unless he himself grew great, it was all meaningless. And so, as the first step toward making him human, I tried to seat him beside a woman. I exposed him to the atmosphere that arose from that setting, hoping to refresh the blood in him that was beginning to rust. Gradually, this attempt began to succeed. What had seemed hard to mix at first began to come together. Bit by bit, he seemed to realize that there was a world outside of himself. One day, he said to me that women were not something to be so easily looked down upon. It seemed that Kei had originally demanded of women the same knowledge and learning he expected from men. When he didn't find it, he would quickly grow contemptuous. Until then, he had never changed his perspective according to gender, but had observed men and women alike with the same gaze. I told him that if it were just the two of us men talking forever, we would merely extend ourselves in a straight line forward. He agreed. At that time, I was a bit infatuated with the daughter, so I naturally used such words. However, I never once revealed my true feelings to Kei. Watching Kei's heart, which had long been walled off by books, slowly open up, gave me no greater pleasure. Since I had started this endeavor with that goal in mind, I couldn't help but feel joy at my own success. I didn't say any of this to him, but I did talk frankly with the widow and her daughter. They seemed satisfied as well. Chapter 26. Although Kei and I were in the same department, our areas of study were different, so naturally there were variations in when we went out and came back. If I returned earlier, I would just pass through his empty room. If I returned later, I would say a brief greeting before going to my own room. Kei would momentarily lift his eyes from his book and glance at me as I opened the sliding door. He would always say, "Just got back." Sometimes I would just nod without a word. Other times, I'd say yeah, and pass by. One day, I had an errand in Kanda and came back much later than usual. I hurried to the front gate and slid the lattice door open. At that moment, I heard the daughter's voice. I was certain the voice came from Kei's room. From the entrance, the house layout was such that the sitting room and the daughter's room were in a row straight ahead, and turning left led to Kei's room and then mine. Having lived there a long time, I could easily tell where and whose voice it was. I quickly shut the lattice. The voice ceased immediately. As I was removing my shoes, I had started wearing those modern lace-up boots, which took some time to deal with. I heard no sound from Kei's room. I thought it strange. Maybe I had misheard, I considered. But when I opened the sliding door to pass through his room as usual, the two of them were sitting there, just as expected. Kei said, "Just got back?" As usual, the daughter also greeted me from where she sat, saying, "Welcome home." Perhaps it was my imagination, but her simple greeting sounded slightly stiff. It struck my eardrums like something slightly off, as if they had stepped awkwardly out of natural rhythm. I asked her, "Where is your mother?" I didn't mean anything by the question. The house just seemed quieter than usual, so I asked. As it turned out, the widow was indeed out. The maid had gone with her, so only Kay and the daughter had remained in the house. I tilted my head slightly. Though I had lived there for a long time, the widow had never once left just the daughter and me alone in the house. I asked the daughter if something urgent had come up. She merely smiled. I disliked women who laughed at such times. Perhaps it was just something typical of young women, but the daughter was someone who liked to laugh at trivial things. However, upon seeing my expression, she quickly returned to her usual demeanor and replied seriously that it wasn't urgent, just some small errand. As a boarder, I had no right to press further. I said nothing more. Before I had even changed clothes and settled down, the widow and the maid returned. Soon, it was time for dinner, when everyone gathered around the table. At first, I had been treated as a guest, and the maid would bring a tray for each meal. But over time, that formality faded, and I began being called to the main dining room. When Kay moved in, I insisted that he be treated the same. In return, I gifted the widow a collapsible, delicate table made of thin wood. Nowadays, such tables are common in homes, but back then, few families sat around one like that to eat. I had gone all the way to a furniture shop in Achinamizu to have it made to my design. At dinner, the widow explained that the fishmonger hadn't come at the usual time, so she had to go buy something to feed us. That made sense to me, since they had boarders in the house. Just as I was thinking that, the daughter looked at my face and started laughing again. This time, though, she was immediately scolded by the widow and stopped. Chapter 27. About a week later, I passed again through the room where Kay and the daughter were talking together. As soon as the daughter saw my face, she burst out laughing. I probably should have asked her right then what was so funny, but instead, I remained silent and went straight to my room. Because of that, Kay didn't say his usual, "Elle just got back." The daughter seemed to immediately slide open the paper screen and go into the sitting room. At dinner, the daughter said I was a strange person. Even then, I didn't ask why she thought so. I only noticed that the widow shot her a sharp glance. After dinner, I took Kay out for a walk. We went from the back of Denzuin Temple around the Botanical Garden Road and came out at the bottom of Tamazaka Hill. It wasn't a short walk, but we said very little during it. By nature, Kay was even more taciturn than I was. I wasn't particularly talkative either, but as we walked, I tried to initiate conversation as much as I could. Most of my questions were about the family we boarded with. I wanted to know what he thought of the widow and her daughter, but his replies were vague and ambiguous. They were simple, yet lacked clarity. He seemed more focused on his major studies than on the two women. Of course, exams for our second academic year were drawing near, so from a practical point of view, he was the more proper student. Moreover, he would go on about Swedenborg this or that, which surprised someone as unlearned as myself. When we successfully finished our exams, the widow was pleased, saying we only had one more year to go. Her daughter's graduation, the widow's only real pride, was also approaching. Kay said to me that women graduate without knowing anything. He seemed to completely dismiss things like sewing, koto playing, or flower arranging, which the daughter was learning outside of school. I laughed at his ignorance, repeating the old argument that a woman's value doesn't lie in such things. He didn't particularly object, but he didn't agree either. That pleased me. His attitude, as if he were scoffing, still seemed to belittle women. It felt like he didn't even consider the daughter, whom I knew well, to be worth mentioning. Looking back now, my jealousy toward Kay had already begun to sprout at that time. I asked Kay if we should go somewhere for summer break. He spoke as if he didn't want to go. Of course, he wasn't free to go anywhere on his own, but if I invited him, there was no reason he couldn't. I asked why he didn't want to go. He said there was no reason, just that he preferred to stay home and read. When I argued that going to a cool place would be better for his health, he said, "Then you should go alone." But I couldn't bring myself to leave him alone with the others in the house. I already didn't feel comfortable watching Kei grow closer to the family. If someone asked why I felt worse seeing what I had originally hoped for, that would be the end of it. I must have been foolish. Eventually, the widow stepped in and mediated, unable to watch our endless back and forth. In the end, Kei and I decided to go to Bushu together. Chapter 28. Kei was not a man who traveled much. It was my first time in Bushu as well. Not knowing anything, the two of us disembarked at the first place the ship reached. I believe it was called Hoda. I don't know how much it has changed since, but at that time it was a wretched fishing village. First of all, the entire place reeked of fish. And when we entered the sea, we were quickly knocked over by the waves and ended up scraping our hands and feet. Large rocks the size of fists were tossed about constantly by the waves. I quickly grew tired of it, but Kei neither praised nor complained. At least his expression remained calm. Even so, every time he entered the sea, he managed to injure himself somehow. Eventually, I persuaded him to leave, and we moved on to Tamura. From Tamura, we moved again to Neko. The entire coast was already a popular destination for students at that time, so everywhere we went was a suitable spot for us to bathe in the sea. Kei and I often sat together on rocks by the shore, gazing at the distant color of the sea or the bottom of the water near us. The water seen from atop the rocks was especially clear. Small fish of colors like red and indigo, not usually seen in markets, swam about in the transparent waves, clearly visible. I often spread out books there and read, while Kei mostly remained silent, doing nothing. I couldn't tell whether he was deep in thought, absorbed in the scenery, or lost in pleasant imagination. From time to time, I would look up and ask him what he was doing. He would simply reply that he was doing nothing. I often thought how pleasant it would be if the person sitting silently beside me weren't Kei, but the young lady. That alone might have been fine, but sometimes I would suddenly suspect that Kei, too, was sitting there with the same hope in his heart. At such times, I could no longer remain calmly reading. I would abruptly stand up and shout loudly without restraint. I couldn't recite poetry or songs in any delicate way. I could only howl like a savage. One time, I suddenly grabbed him by the collar from behind and asked, "What would you do if I shoved you into the sea like this?" Kei didn't move. Still facing away, he said, "Go ahead, that's fine." I immediately let go of his neck. It seemed that Kei's nervous exhaustion had already improved quite a bit by that time. In contrast, I was becoming more and more sensitive. I envied Kei for being calmer than I was. At the same time, I resented him. He never showed any sign of engaging with me. That gave me the impression that he had a kind of confidence. Yet even if I acknowledged that confidence in him, I could not feel satisfied. My suspicion took a step further. I wanted to understand its true nature. Had he regained hope in his academic or career prospects and seen a bright path ahead for himself? If that were all, there would be no conflict of interest between us. In fact, I might have felt pleased that my efforts to support him were worthwhile. But if his peace of mind was in regard to the young lady, I could never forgive him. Strangely, Kei seemed completely unaware of my feelings for her. Of course, I never acted so obviously that Kei would have easily noticed. Kei was generally slow to pick up on such matters. From the beginning, I had felt so secure in that aspect of his personality that I had invited him to my home without hesitation. Chapter 29. I resolved to open my heart to Kei, though in truth, this decision hadn't just occurred to me during the trip. I had made up my mind even before we left, but I had neither found the right opportunity nor been able to create one myself. Looking back now, the people around me at that time were all rather strange. No one ever discussed matters related to women in any personal way. Perhaps many simply had nothing to talk about, but even those who might have kept silent as a matter of course. From the perspective of people like you, living in a relatively freer atmosphere, this must seem bizarre. Whether that was due to lingering moralism or a kind of shyness, I'll leave to your interpretation. Kay and I talked about everything. Occasionally, topics like love or affection would come up, but they always ended up being abstract discussions. Even that didn't happen often. Most of our conversations revolved around books, academic matters, future careers, ambitions, and self-discipline. No matter how close we were, once the relationship grew formal like that, it wasn't easy to break the tone suddenly. We simply became intimate within that stiffness. After deciding to tell Kay about the young lady, I was tormented countless times by frustration. I felt like piercing one spot in his head and blowing soft air into it. To you, this may sound absurd, but at the time, it was a truly difficult challenge for me. I was as cowardly during the trip as I had been at home. I constantly observed Kay in hopes of seizing the right moment, but his strangely lofty demeanor was beyond my control. To my mind, it was as if his heart was thickly lacquered in black lacquer. The blood I tried to pour into it was completely repelled. At times, Kay's strength and composure made me feel relieved. I would then regret my suspicions and even apologize to him in my heart. But as I did, I saw myself as an inferior person and was overcome with self-loathing. Yet, before long, the old suspicions would return and strike back even harder. Everything stemmed from my doubts, and thus, everything worked against me. Even in appearance, Kay seemed more appealing to women. His temperament, free of fussiness like mine, seemed more attractive to the opposite sex. His slightly naive but also dependable air seemed to give him the advantage. In terms of academic ability, though we studied different fields, I was aware that I was no match for Kay. Whenever all of Kay's strengths flickered before my eyes at once, the brief peace I had felt immediately gave way to renewed unease. Kay, seeing my restless state, told me that if I was uncomfortable, I could return to Tokyo. But once he said that, I suddenly no longer wanted to go back. Perhaps I didn't want Kay to return to Tokyo alone. The two of us traveled around the Boshu Peninsula and came out the other side. Under the blazing sun, we trudged along, deceived by misleading signs about distances in Kazusa. I didn't even understand why we were walking like that. I joked to Kay about it. He replied, "Because we have legs, we walk." Then he would wade into the sea to cool off, without concern for the location. Afterward, the harsh sun would beat down on us again, leaving our bodies weary and limp.